Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Life and Books and Everything. I'm Kevin DeYoung, and I'm joined by my special guest, say more about in just a moment. Erika, you just told me, Bachiochi?
You could say it just like that. That's great.
I could say it like that. Well, you could say
Bachiochi.
It the way it should be. Bachiochi. And I'll say more about her and her book in just a moment, but I want to thank Crossway, as always, for sponsoring the program. And today, just to mention the ESV Scripture Journals. Maybe some of you have used those before, or you're just looking for a real simple way to journal along with the Bible. And so they've made these nice Bibles that have blank pages opposite each page of biblical text. So if you like to journal, or maybe you just want to draw a picture, or you want to copy out the scripture in order to slow down and meditate on it, those ESV Scripture Journals, I have many of them, though I can't say my journaling has taken off since I've had children. So if you have time to journal and you like to journal, you should look at those. All right. My guest today is Erika, and she just said her last name, which is a wonderful last name. And Erika, let me see if I get this straight. All the things that you do: Ethics and Public Policy Center. You're a fellow there. You're a legal scholar. You do pro-life work. You have degrees from multiple New England institutions. So I'm looking forward to hearing your connection there. A senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. You also work and found and direct the Wollstonecraft Project, and we'll say much more about Mary Wollstonecraft in a moment. And the book that we are here to discuss in particular is The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, published by the University of Notre Dame. I guess that came out at the end of last year, or maybe middle part of last year. Yeah, right. So a year ago, I read at the end of last year. So thank you so much for being on here. Erika, we're just becoming acquainted. We have some mutual friends, and I really appreciated the book, and I learned a lot from it. But we would love to just hear about yourself. Where are you from? Tell us about your family. How'd you get interested in writing on these things?
Sure. I mean, it's a long story. I live now outside the Boston area with my husband and actually 7 children, ages 20 down to 3. And my journey, though, is, as I think many, kind of a rocky one and with many twists and turns. So I grew up in a family in Maine, outside of the Camden Rockport area in Maine.
Okay.
And my parents divorced when I was 4. My mother remarried and right away, and then divorced again when I was 13, and then remarried for a third time and divorced for a third time in my upper teens. And so I spent sort of my early teen years reacting, as I think many young girls do, in all sorts of crazy things, drinking, drugs, and the things that go with that for a young girl. And it really hit me pretty hard. And the divorces were then punctuated by 2 suicides of friends of mine. So I kind of had a really sort of tumultuous, not the worst possible childhood. I, lived in safety and had an education, and I was a pretty successful athlete. But it was tough, and there was sort of a lot of, tumult, and especially emotional tumult. So that all sent me reeling into actually 12-step programs, and they're really kind of the saving grace in the sense that I really learned to pray there. Before that, though, I headed up to college at Middlebury College, very liberal college in Vermont, and found myself pretty quickly, along with on the soccer field, also in the Women's Center there, started studying women's studies, sociology. And so you could say that kind of my spiritual, intellectual, moral, emotional journeys were kind of all, headed in sort of different directions, lots of tensions. But when I was praying, as people in 12-step programs do, to kind of this God as we understand him, and was very, at the same time, anti-Christian because of my feminist leanings. And so it was really, I mean, you don't need to hear the whole story, but it was just a many different people in my lives, many different, I went to a couple of different lectures that were really important at different times, read some really important books, but it was just the prayer, I think, that opened me up in a way that maybe those who, had my views wouldn't be opened maybe as much. So I'm just really grateful for having learned to pray and kind of having the docility of the spirit to be open to sort of different perspectives, I guess I would say.
And what's your faith look like today?
Yeah, so I am a faithful Catholic. I attend Mass daily and do all sorts of other kind of norms of Catholic faith. And I'm just really grateful to, understand myself first and foremost and my identity as a child of God. And really grateful for my community, actually very, very rich community here in Massachusetts, if you can imagine it. A couple of years, probably 9 years ago, helped to found a classical school here in Massachusetts that has grown by leaps and bounds. We started with 23 students, now up to 250 students. So it's been really a rich sort of thing. Grateful for it.
That's great. My wife and I met in Massachusetts. I went to Gordon Conwell up in South Hamilton, and my wife was at Gordon College, and we met there and got married in 2002. I should remember when we got married. It was 20 years ago, and we have 9 kids.
Congratulations.
Congratulations on 7. You probably get, well, maybe you don't. We get all the time. Well, are you done? I think, but I thought we were done many times. So we have our oldest is 18. He just graduated from high school, and so all of the bittersweet of sending him off to college. And then our youngest is 1 year old, and everything in between. Where are you? You're right. I don't think of Massachusetts as being a great place to start a classical Christian school, but yet maybe it is, because if there's anybody looking for something different, it might be there in Massachusetts. Where are you, you and your husband at in Massachusetts? Are you still in the Boston area? Yeah,
so we're outside of we're just in the next town over from Foxborough where the Patriots play, but our school is about a half an hour away in Natick. And it does, I mean, it's really just sort of brought together all sorts of people who have either, fled the public schools, aren't satisfied with the intellectual rigor or even kind of religious faith of the Catholic schools. And so it's really brought together kind of a really wonderful community of a lot of young people. So it's really fun, young growing families.
That's great. Did you see the school grow a lot during the pandemic? Our church here oversees a Christian school, K through 12. It's it was around under 900 students, K through 12, when the pandemic started. Now it's over 1,000 students.
Yeah.
And we were afraid that the pandemic was going to do dreadful things, but it sent new families to us in droves. Did you find something similar?
Yeah, I think that's right. That and just sort of the increasing kind of, woke character of public schools and all of that. Yeah, I think it's all the above. I mean, it's an exciting time, I think, to be part of one of these schools where just the kind of, some of us sort of feel like, the Western intellectual tradition is being, really kept up here, really passed on to a new generation. And so it's a really, I think, exciting thing to be doing. I think some of the most important work that the Christian community is doing.
Yeah. So before we get to the book, which is why I have you on here, and thank you for taking time. We were just talking before I hit record that you were on recently with Ezra Klein. So you're doing all of the most important outlets here for the public. But hopefully this is I don't want to say friendly, because I don't think he was unfriendly, but a sympathetic conversation to your argument. But before we get into the book, any day now, maybe it's even today, we're recording this on Monday, June 6th, but sometime very soon, the Dobbs decision will be released. And since it's not every day, you get to talk to a legitimate pro-life legal scholar, you have your JD, you have a real expertise in this. Okay, I want to ask you what you think is going to happen, but let's just assume and prayerfully assume that something like the leaked draft is going to be the final draft. What's your assessment? I'm sure that you read Alito's draft. What do you think that does, and what do you think it means for the future of the pro-life movement?
Yeah, I have to say I was really thrilled with Alito's draft. There were a couple of different small places. I mean, I'm an equal protection scholar, so that section of the brief I probably would have drafted differently. I hope sort of there could be maybe some emendations there for the full draft. But I think the most profound thing that the Alito draft does is correct the history. Because I think that's really where, I mean, of course, other than overturn Roe, but that's where Roe really went astray and really got things very, very wrong, was in the history of abortion law. And so that's, I think, the place where I'm most grateful for how they went about drafting that. And so for those who, haven't read the draft, don't know the history, there was an assumption in Roe based on some just a historian who was a very pro-abortion historian, Cyril Means, that there was this sort of liberty right that women had to obtain abortions until, really the late 19th century. And even then, when he sort of talks about the 19th century laws that, of course, were concurrent with the passage and ratification of the 14th Amendment, which is, of course, the amendment that's at issue in abortion jurisprudence, because that's what they're basing, this liberty or privacy right on. And there really was never this liberty to have an abortion. With the passage of these 19th Amendment abortion statutes that recognized and protected fetal life from the very beginnings of life at conception or fertilization, that all happened because of real changes in understanding of the science of embryology that was coming to pass because of the microscope and because of other sorts of understandings that we just didn't have access to prior to that time. And so we relied on things like quickening. And so, yes, abortion law, there was no way to sort of discern whether an abortion happened prior to quickening. And so the law didn't have the kind of evidentiary means to do so, but there was never a liberty. And so anyway, the real question is what were the laws, pertaining to abortion at the time of the 14th Amendment. And it's just, and he has this great appendix, nearly all of the states had either prohibited abortion throughout the pregnancy or were doing so and did so in the next couple of decades. So to think that, the 14th Amendment could actually protect an abortion right, the right to take the life of a child, is just absurd when the 14th Amendment was written by people, was ratified by populations, was understood by populations to protect, human life. And hopefully we'll see kind of an equal protection at some point as we move down after Roe is overturned. So I think that's where I'm most gratified is the real correction of the history there.
Yeah, that's good. I think he's sitting there. 3/4 of the states at the time of the passage of the 14th Amendment, 3/4 of the states made it a crime, abortion a crime at any point in the pregnancy. And the rest of the states were on their way to passing similar statutes. So to act as if there was any sort of, if this was not only a crime, it would have been, almost unheard of. Not that people have always tried to manage pregnancy in a different way, but the act of abortion would have been considered reprehensible by most people in America. And I don't know if you saw, I make a practice of not taking my political cues from Saturday Night Live, but after the leaked draft, they did this sketch. I guess there's something in the draft that at some point, maybe it's in the historical appendix, he references some medieval statute or scholar or somebody talking about abortion. And of course, SNL did that up and thought that was just hilarious. And, how could we be looking at, are we going to send women back to the old Handmaid's Tale? Right. How do you respond to people? Obviously, that's not a very sophisticated critique, but it resonates sometime on a popular level, looking at why would 21st century Americans and women in particular, of course, if we look to the olden days, we're going to find oppressive regimes. How do you respond to that sort of gut level response that people have?
Yeah, so there's sort of this colorable claim that women couldn't vote before, during the time when all these statutes were being passed. And therefore could not vote for the statutes. And so you sort of think, we've got them,
Yes.
because there were many states that had passed the vote, so that women could vote in state elections, but it wasn't, of course, until the 19th Amendment in 1920 that women were capable of voting, were invited into the, voting in all elections. So, there's this question about well, what about women? What about women? And so what's fascinating about the history, and again, it would have been nice if some of that history had gotten in there too, and sort of some of the equality claims. And I've written a lot about this, not only in the book, but in a big law review article, actually 2 big law review articles on equality arguments for abortion rights. But what's fascinating about this is if you look back at those, the first wave, called the first wave feminists, I call them 19th century women's rights activists, those who ended up, being the agitators for the vote. And we can talk about why they did that. I hope we do, because a lot of that is, has Frances Willard of the Women's Christian Temperance Unions to thank for that. And hopefully we'll get to that. But what's fascinating is that some of the very much non-Christian and in some ways, radical women, and real leaders of the women's movement looking for, equal property rights, equal rights to contract, equal rights in marriage. We can talk about what they meant by that. They were all outspokenly against abortion. So I want to just quote for you one, because the most radical among them, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was pretty radical. We can talk about that. But the most outspoken really, Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president, the first woman to testify before Congress. Outspoken. We can talk about what her radical views were, but on abortion, she was fundamentally opposed. And she championed the rights of children. And she says those rights begin while yet they remain the fetus. So let me just quote kind of a long quote, because I think it's kind of amazing that we think, oh, what about these women? Well, all the women were with, they had different views to the doctors who were lobbying for these kinds of laws. And we can talk about kind of the nuances there with regard to punishment. I'd love to do so. But with regard to the status of the unborn child, and that, abortion was the unwarrantable destruction of human life, as the American Medical Association said at that time, the women's rights activists were in full agreement. So here's Victoria Woodhull. She says in 1870, now this is 2 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, she says, many women who would be shocked at the very thought of killing their children after birth deliberately destroy them previously. If there's any difference in the actual crime, so if there's any difference in the crime of infanticide or abortion, we should be glad to have those who practice the latter, that is abortion, pointed out. The truth of the matter is that it is just as much a murder to destroy life in its embryonic condition as it is to destroy it after the fully developed form is attained, for it is the self-same life that is taken. There's some really good just pro-life logic, right?
Yeah, look at that militant Catholic or fire-breathing evangelical culture warrior.
Right. This is a serious radical woman. And so there were, women's rights advocates were very much, they had all sorts of different views and opposed each other and all sorts of different things. But on these questions of abortion and what they called voluntary motherhood, which may sound to us like, when the pro-choicers talk about forced motherhood, but it's not at all that. They understood themselves, because of the science, they understood themselves to be mothers when the child was growing inside of them.
Right.
And so they understood themselves to have the responsibilities of motherhood at that time, that they were caring for, that they had duties of care to that child. And so all the rights they were clamoring for were what they believed to be necessary in order to carry out those duties to their children, and to society at large. But I think it's really important that we see that. So, you can talk about, what women now think. And even if you put to a vote, you'd see that at least half of women are pro-life.
Right.
And when you get to the details, even more. So, but I think it's kind of an absurd claim to say, that if you
would have given the women could have voted. There would have been, abortion flowing like milk and honey.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Well, let's get into the book, because it's one of the things that's so effective in the book is you're looking at feminist or first wave or 19th century suffragists and trying to understand how they thought. And part of what you're doing is it's reclaiming a lost vision. And it's a lost vision, at least in part, of this Enlightenment author, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, I have to admit that I saw this book and I was excited. I started reading it, And I saw it was a lot about Mary Wollstonecraft, and I almost put it down and thought, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to get into this. So you can relieve me of, and you did through this book, of probably some unfair prejudice, maybe too strong a word, but I teach an Enlightenment elective. So I pastor, and then I teach at the seminary, and I'm actually teaching it next week. I've taught it once before. And so just in one of the last lectures, I have a small section on William Godwin, her husband. And so I have just a even smaller section on Mary Wollstonecraft. But in part because of after she died, and her husband, maybe well-intentioned or not, writes the story of her. She's not. I'll say it this way: she's not the person that, if someone has heard of her, would think, "Oh, as a conservative Catholic or a conservative evangelical, this is someone that I'm really going to have a lot of affinity for." And yet, I think you show in the book why it really is a lost vision. So just a little bit about, and you can fill in the gaps because you're the expert here. Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797. So she dies after giving birth. Her daughter was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, married Percy Bysshe Shelley. So famous family. She died only at 38. I don't know if that's certainly younger than me. 11 days after giving birth to Mary. In 1798, her husband, William Godwin, published an account of his wife's life. Maybe he thought he was doing an honest account of it, but some of what he revealed is she had multiple affairs, an illegitimate child. They had pretended to be married twice. She had tried to commit suicide. They had only agreed to be married when she was pregnant. And that pretty much ruined her reputation and didn't help Godwin's reputation either. And perhaps Godwin was even more of a radical. He wrote things more dismissive of marriage than I think Wollstonecraft did. But her most famous book, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792. So before we get into the specifics, just give us a précis on why Mary Wollstonecraft, why should we give her a hearing when she's not the person, at least in my circles, that if people have heard of, they would think, this is going to really help me think through today's issues from a good conservative or Christian perspective.
Yeah, so I think you're right to bring up Godwin's biography first and foremost, because I think you're also right. I mean, he sort of gives this kind of infers and from past experiences, and therefore then implies to everybody else that she's had these affairs, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
So she, to get sort of into her biography a little bit, she writes the Rights of Women after she had written The Vindication of the Rights of Men as this kind of virginal theorist. So hadn't met a man, and that she was involved with emotionally or physically, all that stuff. And so she has this very high regard for marriage, but not as it was practiced at that time. And that's a really important thing, is I think sometimes we sort of forget the way in which women were, shuffled into marriage by their fathers or left to kind of prostitute themselves. There wasn't really a means for them to, to go about their life in any other way. And so the way, she was living in a very, very different time. But she did then fall in love after she wrote this book, and we'll talk about sort of why I think she's so important in terms of her thinking. But she went on to report on the French Revolution in Paris, and met and fell in love with an American entrepreneur who she then married. But you're right, only in name. And so they held her out as his American wife, in part to protect her as an English citizen in France. But she also very much lived as his wife. She wanted commitment. She just didn't want to be under the really unjust marital laws at that time. And so she relies on his provision for a year after their first child, who she brings into the marriage with Godwin later, after Imlay leaves her in pretty much the same way that she had warned her readers in the Rights of Women. He left her philandering with other women, and she writes all these really beautiful love letters about the beauty of domestic life, of calling him to fatherhood, which is very much thematic with what she does in the Rights of Women. So, one of her main themes in the Rights of Women is that, women's immiseration is caused by many things, but very much caused by what she calls the want of chastity in men. And so she wasn't at all interested in pushing aside chastity for women. She believed chastity and modesty and, as she says, the whole train of virtues was important for both sexes, but that there was a real focus on chastity, that women were sort of responsible for chastity. This comes right out of Rousseau, who was one of her main interlocutors. And so she really thinks, men have these greater libidos and they should be responsible for chastity too. And so she's really calling men to fatherhood, calling men to treat women with dignity as rational creatures, as she says. And so that's her real bugaboo, I would say, is, seeing that the only virtue women were sort of called to was chastity, when she wanted to call women to live out all the virtues, because she thought that that's the way to happiness, was to use one's freedom to virtuously fulfill one's duties. So her biography, her kind of tragic biography, after Imlay leaves her, she then, does try to commit suicide twice. I mean, imagine having, again, since you got to read the book to sort of see her very high kind of understanding, really beautiful, I think, understanding of marriage, of relationship between men and women, of the responsibilities of fathers and mothers, and then to have all of that torn away from her. It's sort of, but for the grace of God go I. I think without kind of grace, without being she was raised as an Anglican, but had a really difficult childhood with an alcoholic father. So sort of strayed from that, though I think that really remains the undercurrent of a lot of her natural theology, becomes a Unitarian. But again, Unitarians at that time actually believed something unlike Unitarians today.
Right.
But they didn't believe in kind of the real sanctifying grace that I think she would have really needed to I don't know, be saved from that kind of sorrow that she experienced. So again, but for the grace of God to go I don't think it takes away. I think a lot of people, both left and right, throughout history, throughout time, since her time, have really seen her as kind of one and the same as William Godwin. And that's very much not true. The last thing I'll say, so we can get to her natural theology, is that when he first read The Rights of Woman, when he first met her, which was written in 1792, he really didn't like that book. And so she really, and you can see it, and I kind of trace it a bit, but she changes her views on some things and is closer to Godwin at the end of her life as more of a romantic. But at the time of The Rights of Women, he is an ardent atheist. And so he does not understand the natural theology that undergirds her views about virtue and about reason and about what it is to be a rational creature and what we're called to as rational creatures, to conform our lives to kind of the unerring reason of God. So it makes perfect sense that he's going to write a biography of hers that is very much, dismissive of that natural theology, and just her faith at all. She very much had a very, very strong faith in God. So it's, I think that to understand her through the lens of William Godwin is very much unfair to her.
Yeah, that's really helpful. You helped me reading through the book, see just that there's lots to glean from what she's written. And I have a hard time being sympathetic to much of or anything that William Godwin has to say. Yeah. But there's a lot that you draw out that, like you said there, but by the grace of God go I, a tragic life in many ways, tragic upbringing, tragic ending, and yet in the midst of it, whatever you call it, natural law, natural theology, God's common grace, a lot of important insights. Whereas Godwin goes on, as you know, I'm just, find this quote here. Certainly no ties ought to be imposed upon either party, preventing them from quitting the attachment of marriage whenever their judgment directs them to quit. The abolition of the present system of marriage involves no evils.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing.
That's not going to...
Right. But then you read her on marriage. So this is what's fascinating. She says that the corrupt, so she says, for as marriage has been termed the parent of those endearing charities which draw men from the brutal herd, the corrupting intercourse that wealth, idleness, and folly produce between the sexes. And so that's what she is trying to get at, the corruption. She says, this corruption of marriage is more universally injurious to morality than all the other vices of mankind collectively considered. She talks about, the kind of the real benefits of a rich domestic life. And here's something on fatherhood, which I just think so many of your listeners, reading it was just so compelled by. She says, from the lax morals and depraved affections of the libertine, what results? A finical man of taste who is only anxious to secure his own private gratifications and to maintain his rank in society. But she says the character of a husband and a father forms the citizen imperceptibly, producing a sober manliness of thought and orderly behavior. And what's fascinating is that when you go back, I actually taught a class at LSU recently. And so I was using their text of Vindication of the Rights of Women. And so many kind of modern feminists, just like following Godwin, literally excerpt from the text, all of the theology, all of the, sort of underpinnings, theological underpinnings that she lays her rights claims on, they're all gone from the text. And so all you have is this kind of Godwin-like reading of Wollstonecraft, which is just totally unfair to her. And so it's gone on for, centuries here. So for me, it's like, it's kind of bringing back. And why do I do it? Like, why do I bother with Wollstonecraft? Is that because I think it's important to understand. I was fascinated by these early women's rights advocates in our country, both their understanding. First of all, their, as I mentioned, because I'm a pro-life scholar, their views about abortion, but I kind of wanted to get at like, what was their view of rights? Because rights theory has always been a really interesting thing for me. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg is kind of the leading, sort of, even though she's not a theorist herself, she's the one who kind of helped us all understand rights. I think very much wrongly in the way of sort of rights as kind of for self-definition, for kind of self. And so I wanted to get back, like, who are these people relying on that understood rights as grounded in responsibilities? That's what you see in Seneca Falls. Not all of Seneca Falls is something I would want to applaud, but a lot of it is relying on this kind of natural law understanding of rights. And so you go back, you see that they really rely a lot for Wollstonecraft. So I wanted to go back to her and understand that's what she's relying on, this understanding of that we have this common nature as rational creatures, as created by God, and that we are responsible to God for living well, for our moral life, for growing in intellectual and moral excellence. Like, that's the purpose of life. And she sees the end of life, the highest thing is benevolence, is kind of a moral maturity that helps one to seek the good of the other in all they do, and not to be sort of narrowly focused on self. And that is a radically different view. And so the whole point of the book really is to show, like, we could have gone another way with women's rights that would be much more in keeping with, I think, a much more coherent view of what it is to be human. And we didn't go that way. And so that's why I'm trying to reclaim it, because the 1970s really, really took us very much astray.
So that's really good. So many things there I want to come back to, especially talking about fatherhood, talking about lack of chastity. So you have this line in the book, one of the slogans of the, what we call them, women's rights, suffragists: votes for women, chastity for men. And there's one of the themes throughout your book, drawing from these earlier thinkers, is how sex affects men and women differently. And if I were to summarize it very colloquially, I think one of the arguments that Wollstonecraft is making, you're making through her, is just observational. People saying, hey, look what men get away with. See what they do. See the double standard. I mean, if one of her interlocutors is Rousseau, who famously has 5 children, leaves them basically for dead at the orphanage with mistress, that's going to affect. And if that's seen as, men can do that in a way that women couldn't. So women look, and someone like Wollstonecraft looks, okay, the question is, you can ask 2 different questions. One is, well, why shouldn't we be able to live like men? You talk in the book about the unencumbered male, the especially the post-industrial revolution, the male who seems to be unencumbered and unattached and is able to pursue whatever he wants from his life of career and doesn't have to be bound by rules of chastity. One way to look at all of that is to say, wow, women are getting a raw deal. They are. And if only women could be more like those men. And the pill and abortion gives more ability for women to be like that. And actually, it leads to this presumption that you talk about, the presumption that then men have is, oh, wow, the sexual act can be even more consequence-free. This is even better for the way that a fallen man wants to live. But the other way to look at this observational double standard is, I think what you're saying Wollstonecraft did is to say, this double standard is not correct. This is not right. But there's a way to call both men and women to a life of virtue. And for women to pursue the calling of motherhood is honorable, but it's just as honorable and just as important for the man to pursue this fatherhood. So I just read, this is really, really powerfully stated here toward the end of your book. For as Wollstonecraft foresaw in the late 18th century, the single best response to the sexual asymmetries in both human reproduction and caregiving is an emotionally engaged and deeply attentive fatherhood. Such a fatherhood is most essentially one in which men who sire children recognize the distinctive and irreplaceable bonds they enjoy with them. But even more than that, it is the embrace of fatherhood as a core, constitutive, primary identity for men with children, one that prioritizes the collaborative, character-shaping, solidarity-building work of the home, deeply respects the distinctive burdens women experience in childbearing and childrearing, just as good men in generations past and present have always done. Hear, hear. So just say more about that insight, whether it's yours or yours through Wollstonecraft, and what went wrong is these early women's rights or first wave feminists were seeing something truly a double standard, but then so many went in a direction that has led to the predicament and the suffering that is so much of our modern age.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's a great thread to pick up on that I think is really fundamental. Is I read women's rights and the cause of women's rights through the lens of reproductive and sexual asymmetry. I think, there's a way in which so many people are sort of focused on, later how men and women are just so much the same. And, Mary Wollstonecraft does think we're the same, but how are we the same? We're just the same in being these rational creatures, right? In being responsible to God, as I said, for trying to live lives of moral and intellectual excellence. That's the way we're the same. But we have, as she says, different duties to fulfill. She's especially talking about the duties in the family. Obviously, mothers and fathers have different duties to fulfill. And, we can talk about, and I do, and I sort of trace sort of the kind of economic transitions that happen where women do end up being, pushed into the workplace in the Industrial Revolution, and then with anti-discrimination laws, why some of that happened due to industrialization and sort of the movement of a lot of productive work out of the home and what, and I talk a lot about that. But really, apart from work and the question of work, the things that you've picked up on are really key. And I think it's, to say what the book is about in really simple terms, and just to reiterate what you've said, is that the 1970s feminists really sought equality for men and women on the basis of sort of this male normative, right?
Yeah.
That looked as kind of the male body and the male capacity to, in sex. So men and women, and, engage in the same sexual act, but it is women who end up pregnant, and men can literally walk away. I mean, a lot of men don't walk away, but they can literally walk into the next room, and women then have the consequences of the sexual act, not always, but often, or sometimes at least, inside of them, right? And so to kind of reach this, this unencumbered male, vision of life in which autonomy, I mean, this is what we hear about all the time,
right.
Is this vaunted autonomy. And it really comes out of, and this is another thing, I don't go too deeply into the political theory, but I do mention, do talk about how Wollstonecraft is at a very much distinctive kind of Enlightenment thinker. She very much rejects these state of nature theories that come out of Hobbes and Locke, and really kind of Rousseau and Mill are basing stuff on, where there's this idea of the individual, the kind of, independent individual is the basis of this liberalism. And, the family's kind of in the background. And she rejects that. She says, we're all, both men and women, are deeply interdependent. I mean, look at the agrarian homestead, deeply, deeply interdependent on one another. And so that's right. There's this way in which, what is it about the double standard that is unjust, and how would you make it just? And so I just want to read one of the resolutions from Seneca Falls. So this is 1848, the very first women's rights convention in our country. Again, there's pushback on things like women in the ministry, women in these were Quaker women. So, we could talk about that as religious people and all of that. But those are theological questions. On the kind of natural law stuff, one of the things they say is, this is a resolution, that the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should also be required of man. And the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. So they really are trying to, shape kind of, understand women and men as equal by bringing men up to kind of the responsibilities that women have of necessity biologically in reproduction, just as you said. And how do you see to do that? But in really an invested fatherhood. And so that's really why I call upon Wollstonecraft to really get us to think about, because there is kind of generationally speaking this move. I think good men have always desired to be good fathers, but there's generationally speaking this kind of move for, I see it in the Catholic community, certain in the evangelical community, but also among kind of, some liberal men of wanting to be really deeply invested as fathers, emotionally invested in their children. And I think that's a really good thing that should be built on, but we should see that that's the way to handle these asymmetries, not to kind of say, here's this choice to, take out your child in the womb and then have no responsibilities for anyone. Responsibilities to children is what matures us, what makes us, capable of looking outward. And so I think really working on that would be better for all of us.
Yeah, that's so good. And one of the things I know you bring out in the book is, and you've already talked about it, how these early women's rights advocates were usually, maybe always, staunchly against abortion. They called it child murder. And one of the things, not only because it was murder of the child, but they saw it as deeply anti-women. They saw pregnancy as one of the things that was most enabled and emboldened and allowed women to pursue excellence and virtue. And one of the things you hit on when you come to the 60s and 70s, and even earlier than that with Margaret Sanger, is just how you view, not you, but how one views pregnancy. Is it a gift? Of course, it's a burden, and because of the fall, Genesis 3, it comes with attendant pain and suffering. But is it something to be celebrated and welcomed? So you have this line, I'm just summarizing. Wollstonecraft saw the problem in men's lack of chastity. Margaret Sanger saw the problem in women's fertility. Well, that's going to send you down two very different roads, depending on how you view the problem. And oftentimes, I think when we talk about the differences of men and women, it's sort of as if men get all the good things and they get all the, well, and of course, there's all sorts of ways in which being a man throughout history has been easier and better and more rights than women. And we can be thankful for the ways in which much of that has been ameliorated. And yet we often overlook this incredible gift. Now, my wife isn't convinced yet that my, sympathetic pains for her labor are as much as her real labor pains. I will sometimes jokingly say, you don't know the pain I have that I will never know, a child growing in me. So it's right. It's easy for me to say as a husband. And yet there's something very, deeply profound. And my wife would totally agree, and you probably would as well. A human being nurtured, developing in you. That is something, it's just absolutely shocking. We've come to the point where the question, what is a woman is now a gotcha question. I mean, what is a woman?
Yeah.
People don't know how to answer. I don't know if you saw this over the weekend, but there was some bicycle race and they had the three people on the podium,
Mm,
and the first two were men racing as women,
mm.
and these two transgender, what they're men racing as women, were there. They had got first and second. They clearly have male physiques. They won this cycling race, and they're kissing two men who are, presenting themselves as two
Oh,
women.
wow.
And then the scene that was just like the apotheosis of everything that's going on in our culture. The third place was a woman standing there slightly forlorn holding her newborn baby.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
I mean, you can go see this picture
Yeah.
that was kind of going around in
Yeah.
the last day
Wow.
or two, and it just
Wow.
pictured right there, she was the first
Yeah.
place woman
Wow.
in this
Yeah.
race.
Yeah.
These two men, and
Yeah.
they're embraced, and here's a woman
Yeah.
holding a baby. Because
Mm.
although we know for all sorts of
Wow.
reasons, women often aren't able to have babies, or the Lord
Yeah.
doesn't give them marriage, or they choose not to be married, but yet a woman is fundamentally that person
Yeah.
for whom, if all of the plumbing works and all of the opportunities are there, gives birth to human life. And the
Mm.
degree to which that's honored and celebrated. And so it's one of the really powerful themes in your book is whether or not the life of the family, as Wollstonecraft saw it, with all of the asymmetries and many of the duplicities, is that life of the family to be embraced, or later Betty Friedan, etc., is it to be escaped? And
Yeah.
that really is, in a very simple terms, where the feminist movement went off in such a powerful way. Do you have any hope that that's correctable?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the way that I would think about it in terms of this kind of framework of asymmetry is that these, Wollstonecraft and these early women's rights advocates, they saw asymmetry. And as you say, they celebrated it. They saw, the way in which it caused, as you say, women to be more burdened, but they also see women as more privileged. And that was kind of what nature had dealt women. And they were
Hmm.
they were good with that. They just wanted to see that, as I kind of put it, that culture and law ought to both burden and privilege men with that responsibility as well. And so what they try to do is they have their move is both social and moral, right? So they're trying to make sure that culture is hospitable to women who bear children. And so they want to change laws to ensure that women are protected in that way, especially from, frankly, desolate men. I mean, that's a lot of what their
Hmm.
work is. I mean, that's why, the temperance movement was very much part of the early women's rights movement. As I mentioned Frances Willard earlier, but she's, the longstanding president of the Christian temperance movement. And she's actually the one, we always think of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as the ones that pushed through, suffrage for women, but it's actually Frances Willard who has far more people following her, all
Oh,
state
interesting.
after state, hundreds of thousands of women who are following her. And she calls the ballot the home protection ballot. That we need to protect the home. She says the commandments are voted up or down in every election, and we need more women to be out there voting the commandments up
Yeah.
in order to protect women, in order to get men to carry out their responsibilities and get them out of bars and brothels. That's her effort. So it's a real social and moral cause in that early stage. And what Margaret Sanger does in the early 20th century, is she, instead of offering a social and moral response to these asymmetries, she wants to offer a technological response. And it's very
Yeah,
much
that's well said.
it's in keeping with kind of the modern project writ large, right? That technology can solve all of our problems. We only need science and technology and STEM. We don't need philosophy. We don't need theology
Right.
anymore, right? So what she does is basically says, like, technology can solve the problem. What's the problem? She actually says all of these social and moral, kind of agitating that her contemporaries were going after, they're just mere palliatives, she says. They're like Band-Aids. We have to get to the real problem, which is female fertility. It's the female body. And so, of course, when a whole movement is built upon, basically understanding women as, well, the way, some, degenerate, misformed, misbegotten men, that they really should just be like men if they could just be able to not, bear
which
children.
is, where Aristotle went wrong all those
That's
years
right.
ago.
That's
Yes.
right. That's exactly right. So it's very much in keeping. And I've written something sort of about this, hoping it'll be published soon, about sort of, Plato and Aristotle, who I love in so many ways, but on this
Right.
question of asymmetry, if you put them together, they kind of come up with like the Sangerian approach, which is, to get rid of this, the female, the misbegotten male, the female.
Yeah, a man who didn't quite come out right.
Yeah, that's right. You've got to cure it with technology. And so that's what we're trying to do, And so no wonder we've become, a country that was so pro-natalist, that had children aplenty, this was with a religious founding and all that, has become this incredibly anti-natalist place. And, we want to solve it all with policy. And I think that's great. Let's solve it with some policy. Let's make family much more, let's make it easier to raise families in our country. We absolutely need to, because we're up and against this massive anti-natalism in this country. These women and men, I think, but mainly women, who are deciding, when they're like 19 to, sterilize themselves because they can't imagine. It's like this fear of welcoming another person, caring for another person. It shatters this understanding of ourselves as these autonomous individuals to the core. And we all want to be like these, these very lonely, people who are all by themselves. And it's just astonishing. It's astonishing.
Yeah. And was it Paul Vitz and others have pointed out that so many of our most influential Enlightenment thinkers, you have Rousseau, who abandons children. Locke was single, didn't have any children. Kant didn't have any children. There's somebody else, and lots of other people on the list. Right. And it's not that you can't have good insights, and I'm appreciate many Lockean things, but it just is a fact that your way of seeing the world and how the world exists is going to be very different if that's been your experience. And you talk about the end of the book. We tend to see the world, and maybe this is some of the classic liberalism, which has strengths and weaknesses to it. Right. But you see, we inhabit a world as individuals, and then there's a state, and maybe there's a market. But what about the family? I mean, the classic example of this is the famous, infamous Life of Julia, ad campaign from a number of years ago that just shows during the Obama administration, Julia growing up, and her only relationship is with the various government programs that are nurturing her along the way. There's none of the, to use, the Burkean phrase, little platoons or institutions or churches or religious communities, or even just a family. And it was helpful. You pointed out, because it's easy to think of Wollstonecraft as being, because she was writing to critique Edmund Burke, and to think, well, she's obviously then, Burke is the lodestar of conservatism, then you have Wollstonecraft. But you point out she's critiquing essentially his understanding of aristocracy and monarchy as the way to achieve what they want, but shared with him this fundamental, you could say, conservative instinct that we come into the world inhabiting tradition, inhabiting a culture, and inhabiting a family. And we can't jettison that even if we wanted to. And why would we want to? One of the most essential ways that we live out who God wants us to be, and you say pursue excellence, I say as a preacher, pursue Christ-likeness, pursue holiness, is to embrace this life of the family that God has given us. Do you find, the book, its subtitle is Reclaiming a Lost Vision. Do you find, in talking to college students or younger people, is there a resonance for this lost vision? Are people sensing in the world around them the vision that we have here? I may tell a pollster one thing because I know I have to pretend like I don't know what a woman is, but deep down, that's ridiculous. Are you finding resonance with this vision as you try to explain it to people?
Yeah, I think our country is just really divided right now. But I think, one of the reasons for writing the book is really to speak to the left on this stuff, where, as I did with Ezra Klein, there's sort of this understanding of, that they want to speak out for the disenfranchised. They want to, talk about the poor and all that. And I just think the vision that that I think, as you said, as you mentioned Burke, but that Wollstonecraft has of really the givenness that we're born into families that we did not choose. Just want to note too that John Adams reads Wollstonecraft, and Abigail Adams calls herself Wollstonecraft's pupil. They really see her as an American thinker. And I think that's right. I think that she does critique aristocracy and monarchy from the basis of enduring principles, that she says traditions are important, but we need to make sure that we're, reasoning through things on the basis of these enduring principles of who we are as these rational creatures. But I think there is a way in which people, as you point out to the Julia, that we can't help but, if we really are pushed to see it, we can't help but see that we're human beings who are raised in families for good or ill, but that really that nurturance that happens in a family or should happen in a family is really the most important thing. I mean, I think a lot of, whether it's progressives or non-Christians and whatever, when they have children, and again, a lot of people aren't having children, so they aren't getting to experience this, but they begin to see that the work they do as parents, as mothers and fathers, is really their most important work. They don't see that as someone when they look at other children and they find them annoying or whatever. But when they actually have their own children, they see that. And so they don't want to be, beholden to their job as though it's the most important thing, or they don't want to, have, but it's like, an understanding. I think this is another theme that really is important in the book is that the market and the state exist fundamentally for the family and for the flourishing of human beings, and that nurture takes place in the family. And so we need to be sort of organizing things with the family in mind. It's one of the examples I give is that environmentalists often want to look at, kind of our the ecology around us, which we should look at our natural ecology and ask, how is it that policies that the state or in the market impact our natural ecology? Great, do it. Well, we should also be looking at how, market policy, things that happen in the market or the state policies are impacting the family, that we kind of should have impact statements, because there's been a lot of real kind of, as things have deregulated both in the market, but then as the state has gotten more encroaching and sort of woke kind of ways, it's a real disintegration of the family. How can we get back to the time in which, not so much going back to like the 1950s when there's all sorts of problems, but an understanding of really the family is doing the most important work. And so that's where sort of the community should be focusing on. And I think there is a resonance with that kind of message for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you've written a book. Glad you're saying that. And there's so much more I wanted to get into. I was going to ask you about, you mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then maybe sort of her counterpart, Mary Ann Glendon, who figures prominently at the end of the book, and people should definitely look her up, and really remarkable figure in her own right. But we can bring this back to Genesis, that God created a man and a woman. And when he saw that it was not good for the man to be alone, we often read that just as companionship. He was alone. Well, if it was just aloneness, he could have made a fleet of golden retrievers. He could have, just made a bunch of buddies, and they could have literally had a man cave there and could have done, guy things. But it's the fittedness of man and woman in particular to fulfill what the man could not do alone, and that was to be fruitful and multiply. And that's why God creates the helpmeet from his side. And the Puritans, had this great line that she was from his side, not to rule over him, not to be trampled underneath him, but from his heart to be loved and embraced and protected. And it's a fundamentally Judeo-Christian vision that counter Aristotle or Plato, that the creation of woman is not a deformed man who needs to be emboldened to really be a man, and then she can really have full equality. But God, really unique in world religions, creates man and woman equally in the image of God, and creates them each for each other, fitted for each other. So I love this lost vision that you're reclaiming. I'm going to give you the last word. I'm going to just read it, and you can respond to this or let this paragraph be your final word, Erika. But this was really good. I take this to be a really good summary of the book. This is toward the beginning. You say, the trouble with the women's movement today lies rather in its near abandonment of Wollstonecraft's original moral vision, one that championed women's rights so that women with men could virtuously fulfill their familial and social duties. Nowhere is such an abandonment clearer than in the revolutionary assault on the mutual responsibilities that inhere in sex, childbearing, and marriage that began in the 60s and 70s. The modern day fusion of the women's movement with the sexual revolution is one that most regard, for good or ill, as intrinsic to the cause of women's rights. But it is not. Rather, it is a great departure from Wollstonecraft's original moral vision and that of the early women's rights advocates in the United States. It has cheapened sex, objectified women, belittled the essential contribution of both mothers and fathers, and has contributed to upending the American promise of equal opportunity for the most disadvantaged men, women, and children today. I take it that's what the book is about. I love the book, and that's such a great word. Any last final words?
I'll let that be the last word.
Well, you worked so hard to write that paragraph. You just let it stand on its own.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. It's
Thank you, Erika.
Pleasure.
Again, the book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, published last year by University of Notre Dame Press. Thank you for being with us, Erika, and to all our listeners, Life Books and Everything. Until next time, glorify God, enjoy Him forever, and read a good book.